In the previous episode, we explored what it means to see. We saw that often reality is mixed with interpretation, memory, fear, reaction, and even image. And nowhere is this more important than in our relationships with other human beings, because perhaps the hardest thing in life is to see another person clearly. Now, this exploration is not about trying to move us emotionally for a few moments. A touching story may affect us temporarily. A powerful moment may soften us briefly, but often these feelings fade and then the old reactions return. So this is not merely an attempt to pull at the heartstrings. It is an attempt to understand something more fundamental. Why do human beings so quickly move into hurt, reaction, judgment, division, and image? Why do we stop seeing one another clearly? What is actually happening inside us? Because if we only try to force kindness or positive feelings on top of confusion, the deeper movement underneath may continue unchanged. But if we begin understanding the roots of reaction itself, then perhaps something more real can begin changing. Not a temporary emotion, not forced morality, but clearer seeing from the ground up. The purpose of this episode is simple. It is to make clear how important it is to see a human being as a human being. Not as a role, not as a label, not as a memory, not as an image, and definitely not as what they mean to us. Because when we stop seeing the human being clearly, relationship begins to change, hurt grows, misunderstanding grows, division grows, and ordinary moments become fields of reaction. So this episode is an invitation to observe this carefully in daily life. How quickly does the image enter? How quickly memory enters? How quickly another person becomes covered by the past? Because perhaps a more humane world begins very simply with learning to see a human being as a human being. And perhaps we should also ask something even more basic. Is it really too much to ask that one human being sees another human being as a human being? Has this become something extraordinary? Something to be achieved only after many years of spiritual practice or self-development? Because if we look carefully, what is often considered normal in daily life is actually quite strange. We easily become irritated with one another. We reduce people to labels quickly. We carry hurt for years. We react to images more than to people themselves. And slowly this becomes accepted as ordinary human behavior. But perhaps the real question is not, how do we become superhuman? Perhaps the question is, why have we become comfortable being less human than we could be? Because seeing another person clearly should not be something unnatural. Perhaps it is one of the most natural things possible once fear, hurt, image, and unconscious reactions are seen clearly. Now let's talk about the human being and the image. Think back to the last person you met. Maybe it was a friend, a spouse, a child, someone at work, a stranger, perhaps even a parent. You may feel that you simply met that person. But did you? Because something subtle may have happened. At first, nothing seems unusual. There is a person in front of you, you're speaking, listening, responding, but almost immediately, the person may no longer be just a person. Something from your own mind may have entered the meeting. Their role, their tone, their appearance, their past with you, and before you realize it, the human being in front of you has been quietly replaced. Not by another person, but by what they mean to you. You're meeting a memory, a reaction, an idea, an image. A memory, perhaps the last argument or the time they criticized you. A reaction, let us say you had a meeting prior to this that disturbed your mind. And with that disturbed mind, it manifests itself in you as the tightening in your body, the irritation, the guarded tone. And with all of that, you're meeting this person. Or maybe it's an idea that you've built over time. He never listens to me. She is difficult. They don't respect me. Or even over time, you've built an image which you quite cannot verbalize, but you know that the person affects you. So the person is there, but what you meet is already shaped by the mind. And because this happens so naturally and so fast, we rarely question it. Let's see how relationships become distorted. This does not happen only in difficult relationships, it happens everywhere. With spouses, with children, with friends, with parents, with colleagues, with strangers. A spouse becomes the person who never listens. A child becomes the difficult one. A parent becomes someone who never understood me. A colleague becomes someone competing against me. A stranger becomes someone unsafe, someone rude, or someone beneath me. And once the image enters unseen, the relationship is already distorted. Because now we are no longer responding only to the human being in front of us, we are responding to memory, to hurt, to expectation, and even to interpretation. Let's look at the larger inquiry. What we begin to see is that our inability to see a human being as a human being does not affect only our relationship with others, it affects the whole movement of perception. If I cannot see another person without image, memory, fear, or judgment, then I probably cannot see myself clearly either. And if I cannot see myself clearly, then my seeing of life will also become distorted. How we see work, success, failure, criticism, love, and responsibility. So this inquiry begins with seeing a human being as a human being, but it opens into a much larger question. Can we see anything clearly when the mind is looking through memory, fear, judgment, and the past? Let me give you a simple example. John is at home. His father says, "A neighbor will stop by. Seat him, offer him coffee. I'll be home soon." The neighbor arrives. John opens the door. A well-dressed man stands there, polite, composed. John welcomes him warmly and offers him a seat. Then John goes into the kitchen and his mother says casually, "That's the neighbor your father mentioned. He might take the old bike." The bike? The one John quietly hoped would one day be his. Something shifts. When John returns with the coffee, the room has not changed, the man has not changed, but John's seeing has changed. Now a thought appears, he's the one taking my bike. Warmth cools, courtesy becomes mechanical, irritation moves beneath the surface. The neighbor is no longer simply a neighbor. He has become someone associated with loss, John's loss. Later his mother says they recently lost most of their belongings in a fire. Your father isn't selling the bike, he's giving it to them. And instantly the image collapses. The man in the room is no longer the one taking my bike. He is someone who has lost more than John imagined. The bike has not changed, the neighbor has not changed, only John's interpretation has changed. And with that shift, sympathy arises, not as effort, not as virtue, but as clearer seeing. Let's talk about the impact of interpretation in relationships. This is one of the central movements we are exploring. The mind does not merely perceive, it adds. You hear a tone and remember past hurt. You see a facial expression and assume judgment. Someone becomes quiet and the mind says something is wrong. A delayed reply becomes rejection. A disagreement becomes disrespect. A forgotten birthday becomes, "I don't matter." A short message becomes coldness. A lack of enthusiasm becomes, "they no longer care." And once that interpretation is taken as reality, reaction begins. We think we are reacting to the person, but often we are reacting to what the mind says the person means. And now let's look at the difference between reaction and response. At this point, someone may ask, "But isn't this natural? If someone insults me, irritation arises. If someone cuts me off in traffic, anger arises. If someone hurts me, distance appears. What is wrong with that?" Nothing is wrong with the first reaction appearing. The body reacts, emotion arises, thought forms. This is part of being human. The issue is not that reaction appears. The issue is that we often do not see it as a reaction. We immediately experience it as truth. Anger appears and the mind says, I'm right. Hurt appears and the mind says, they don't care. Fear appears and the mind says, this is danger. So the problem is not the arising of reaction, the problem is unconscious identification with it. So why does the mind interpret the way it does? Because that is how we have trained it in the past. Not deliberately perhaps, not consciously, but through repeated experiences, influences, reactions, and conclusions. The mind learns certain patterns. If someone criticized us before, the mind becomes alert to criticism. If someone disappointed us before, the mind begins to expect disappointment. If we were hurt in a certain kind of relationship, the mind becomes ready to protect itself in similar situations. So the interpretation is not random. It often comes from conditioning. The mind has learned this kind of tone means danger. This kind of silence means rejection. This kind of feedback means I'm not valued. And once the mind has learned this, it does not wait for reality to fully reveal itself. It quickly fills in the meaning. That is why two people can experience the same event differently. The event may be the same, but the mind meeting it has been trained differently. So when we say, I saw what happened, we may actually be seeing what the mind has been trained to see. That is why seeing is so important. Only when the interpretation is seen can we begin to understand how the past shapes the present. Let me share something from my own life. I used to bargain a lot with auto drivers, street vendors, and people helping with luggage. I would try to reduce the price even by a small amount, and if I succeeded, it felt like a small victory. It felt normal. It felt practical. It felt like I was being careful. And yet, when it came to a beggar, I would often give something without thinking much. No bargaining, no calculation, just giving. At a talk, someone said something simple that stayed with me. He pointed out that people we bargain with are often working hard for a living. They stand in the sun, they face the weather, they struggle through the day. And we may be reducing a small profit that means much more to them than it does to us. When I heard that, something became clear. It was not that I was trying to be unfair. It was simply unconscious, a habit, a way of seeing I had never questioned. And after that, something shifted naturally. Not because I created a new rule for myself, but because the person became more visible than the transaction. Now when I meet someone working hard for a living, there is a different sensitivity. I may still discuss price, but the way I see the person has changed. That is what we are exploring here. Not trying to become good, but seeing clearly enough that action changes naturally. Imagine someone insulted you last week. A week later, you meet them again. What happens? Do you meet the person or do you meet the memory of the insult? If you are unaware, the past speaks before you do. The body tightens, the tone changes, distance appears, the old story returns. But if you are aware, you notice the memory arising. You notice the tightening. You notice the thought, this is the person who insulted me. And because it is seen, it no longer completely controls the response. You may still choose distance. You may still choose firmness. You may still choose a conversation. But now the action is clearer. You are not pretending nothing happened. You are simply not letting the past unconsciously decide how you see now. Very often we stop seeing human beings and begin seeing roles instead. Boss, employee, customer, driver, waiter, politician, rich person, poor person. And once the role becomes stronger than the human being, relationship changes. A waiter spills water and irritation appears quickly. But if we suddenly remember this is another human being trying to get through the day, the response changes. The outer situation may remain the same, but inwardly there is greater humanity. And now let's look at the speed of image formation. The mind forms images very quickly. One comment, one disagreement, one political opinion, one social media post, and suddenly the mind says, this is who they are. But human beings are far more complex than a single moment, opinion, or reaction. Yet the mind prefers quick conclusions because conclusions feel psychologically safe. We do not only carry images about others, we also carry images about ourselves. I'm intelligent, I'm a failure, I'm attractive, I'm not good enough. And once we begin living through these images, our relationship with life becomes distorted. Praise strengthens the image, criticism threatens it, comparison feeds it, fear protects it, and much of human reaction begins from protecting psychological images. Let's talk about how fragile we are within. Just think about this carefully. We have made extraordinary advances outwardly technology, science, communication, medicine, and yet a single comment can disturb us for hours. A sentence, a tone, a look, and suddenly the mind becomes restless, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Why? Because the comment did not merely touch words, it touched image, it touched identity, it touched the psychological structure we carry about ourselves. Perhaps this is one of the great missing pieces of education. We teach children mathematics, science, history, technology, language, but we do not always teach them how to understand themselves, how fear moves, how comparison creates pressure, how hurt is carried, how image shapes relationship, how thought turns a small reaction into suffering. Part of the difficulty is that this area has often been approached through separate religions, beliefs, and traditions. Each tradition may contain wisdom, but when each one protects its own border, schools may avoid the subject altogether. So perhaps what is needed is a simpler and more universal approach, an approach that does not depend on belief or conversion or belonging to one tradition, an approach based on observation, on seeing, on understanding what actually happens within the human mind, how thought moves, how fear arises, how hurt forms, how comparison begins, how reaction takes over. That may be one way schools can touch this deeply human subject without creating division. Not by telling children what to believe, but by helping them learn how to observe themselves. Because perhaps education is incomplete if it teaches us how to understand the world, but not how to understand the mind that is meeting the world. Workplaces too can provide education that helps people understand themselves better. Not only technical education, not only skills training, but education in the kinds of movements we are exploring in these episodes. How reaction spreads, how fear affects communication, how comparison creates pressure, how image affects relationship, how hurt quietly shapes behavior. This kind of understanding can help a person grow inwardly. And it can also help develop a workplace environment where people are more able to see one another as human beings. And perhaps nowhere is this more important than in parenting. A parent may deeply love a child and still unknowingly relate through fear, comparison, expectation, pressure, or even image. The child becomes the successful one, the difficult one, the sensitive one, or even the disappointment. And slowly the child may begin living inside those labels. A careless comment, repeated often enough, may become part of how the child sees themselves. Comparison with siblings, classmates, or other children may quietly plant insecurity. Fear-based parenting may create fear-based living. Pressure may create anxiety instead of understanding. And much of this may happen unconsciously, simply because parents themselves were shaped in similar ways. Perhaps parenting is not only about shaping the child, but also about understanding the mind that is shaping the child. Because parents are not only raising a child for today, they are influencing the human being that child may become tomorrow. The way a child is seen, listened to, spoken to, encouraged, or heard may quietly shape how they later relate to themselves, to others, and to the world. And perhaps this is why psychological understanding in parenting matters so deeply. Not to become perfect parents, not to create guilt, but to become more aware of how relationships shape the human mind. because perhaps the future of humanity is influenced not only in governments, schools, and institutions, but also in ordinary moments between parent and child. A moment of listening, a moment of patience, a moment where the child is seen as a human being and not merely as an extension of expectation, fear, or comparison. Perhaps this too is part of moving towards a more humane world. Every unnecessary reaction creates a wave of disharmony. A harsh word spreads tension, an unconscious reaction passes hurt from one person to another. Anger moves through relationships, fear spreads through families, comparison spreads through schools, pressure spreads through workplaces, and often what began as one unconscious reaction continues moving through many human beings. A parent returns home frustrated from work and speaks harshly to a child. The child carries that hurt into school. Another child is treated poorly in return, and the movement continues. Or someone is humiliated at work. They carry irritation into their marriage, into parenting, into daily interaction. So often, human beings are passing unresolved reactions from one person to another. And because this movement is mostly unconscious, it keeps repeating. I have seen this in my own life too. There were moments when irritation from one situation unconsciously entered another. A difficult interaction earlier in the day would quietly affect how I spoke later to someone else. And only afterwards would I realize that the second person had nothing to do with the original problem. Seeing this was important because once the movement becomes visible, there is at least the possibility that it may not continue automatically. Perhaps the opposite is also true. A moment of awareness may stop that movement. A moment of understanding may prevent unnecessary hurt from spreading further. A more humane response may quietly change the atmosphere around us. And perhaps this is how humanity grows, not only through large ideas, but through small moments of clearer seeing in daily life. Perhaps one of the great needs of our time is not merely more information, not merely more technology, not merely greater outward success, but a deeper understanding of ourselves and one another. Because without that understanding, the same fear, division, hurt, and conflict continue repeating through human relationship. We may advance outwardly while remaining inwardly confused. And perhaps this is why learning to see clearly matters so much. To see another human being without immediately reducing them to an image, to see our own reactions as they arise, to become more aware of the movement of thought, hurt, fear, and interpretation. Because perhaps humanity does not change only through systems, policies, or technology, perhaps it also changes through the way we meet one another each day. Another example is customer service. Many of us have been frustrated with a company and then taken that frustration out on the person answering the phone. I have done this too. In one case, it was an auto renewal issue. I was upset, but later I saw something simple. The person on the other end was not personally doing anything to me. They were just following a process. They were operating within a system. Nothing intentional, nothing personal. The same thing happened with marketing calls. I used to get irritated when callers reached out at inconvenient times asking whether I wanted something. But gradually I began seeing another side of it. They were not merely annoying callers, they were also human beings trying to earn a living. That does not mean we must accept every call, agree to everything, or avoid setting boundaries. We can still say no. We can still end the call. We can still be firm. But the question becomes, can we say no while still seeing the human being? Can we respond without turning the person into the problem? That is the shift. The outer action may remain the same, but inwardly something is different. There is less hostility, less unconscious reaction, less unnecessary hurt moving from one human being to another. Let's look at a wider perspective. Just imagine an alien observing us. What would surprise them? They would see extraordinary brilliance, science, technology, medicine, communication. At the same time, they would see how we treat one another, the brilliance on one side and the lack of humanity on the other. That contrast would be striking. How can a species be so intelligent outwardly and yet so easily disturbed inwardly? How can we build advanced systems and still fail to meet another human being without image, prejudice, fear, or hurt? That question is not meant to condemn us, it is meant to awaken inquiry. At this point, someone may naturally ask, what is a person who truly sees supposed to be like? How would someone who can really see behave? But perhaps even this question can become another trap, because then the mind may begin creating an ideal image to imitate. I should always be calm. I should never react. I should always be compassionate. And then behavior slowly becomes performance rather than understanding. Outwardly, a person may appear patient or kind, while inwardly, confusion, hurt, fear, and conflict continue underneath. So, this explanation is not trying to create a perfect human being to copy. It is trying to help us see more clearly, because perhaps the important thing is not to become someone else, but learning to see what is actually happening within ourselves moment to moment, seeing how reaction begins, seeing how hurt is carried, seeing how image shapes relationship, seeing how thought turns simple events into psychological suffering. As we begin to understand the triggers that repeatedly kidnap us from the present moment, there may gradually be more moments in which we can actually see clearly. More moments where we meet another human being without so much distortion from the past. And perhaps clarity grows in this way, not suddenly becoming perfect, through increasing moments of seeing. And as those movements become clearer, action itself may gradually begin changing naturally, not according to an ideal, not according to imitation, but according to understanding. And perhaps a person who can truly see is not someone acting according to a fixed pattern. Life is living. Each situation is different. Sometimes clarity may express itself through patience, sometimes through firmness, sometimes through distance, sometimes through deep listening. But in all these situations, the action becomes less driven by unconscious reaction and psychological image. In this episode, we looked at one important area of seeing, seeing another human being clearly. But seeing is not limited to people. We are seeing all the time. We see objects, we hear sounds, we meet thoughts, we feel emotions, we encounter memories, fears, desires, and reactions. Some of these are outside us, some are happening within us. And if we do not understand these different kinds of seeing, we may miss much of what is actually shaping our lives. So, in the next episode, we will explore this more carefully. So now it's time for a wrap up. Perhaps seeing a human being as a human being sounds very simple, and in one sense, it is simple. But as we have explored in this episode, many things quickly enter between perception and relationship. Memory, fear, image, comparison, interpretation, reaction, and before we realize it, we are no longer meeting the human being directly. So this episode has been an invitation to begin noticing these movements more carefully in daily life. Not to force ourselves to become something, not to imitate an ideal human being, but to begin seeing more clearly what actually happens within us when we relate to one another. Because perhaps humanity grows in small moments like these. Moments where reaction does not completely take over. Moments where memory does not fully distort the present. Moments where another human being is seen a little more clearly. And perhaps that is where a more humane world begins. Before we close, I would like to leave you with a simple image. Imagine a soft pillow in the shape of the earth, a soft earth, and imagine yourself holding it gently, hugging it, and giving it all the love you can, because this earth includes all of us, humanity, animals, plants, and the environment. Everything living together on this small planet. Perhaps from time to time we can return to this image, a soft earth held with care. If you found something meaningful in this episode, please tell others about it. This is First Steps to Seeing Reality, and perhaps the first step is simply to begin noticing. Thank you for listening.